There is a moment, and if you are honest with yourself, you have lived it, where you knew something was wrong. You felt it in your chest. You felt it in your gut. Every instinct you had was screaming at you to stop, to speak up, to walk away. And yet, you didn't. You stayed quiet. You kept going. You followed the instructions. And afterward, when it was over, you sat alone somewhere and asked yourself a question that no one talks about at the dinner table. How did I let that happen? How did I let someone else's voice become louder than my own? You told yourself it was the situation. You told yourself you had no choice. But deep down you knew. You always knew. The truth is, you were not weak. You were not broken. You were human. And what happened to you has happened to almost every human being who has ever lived. This is the story of why. Before we go any further, we want to hear from you. Before we get deeper into this, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's go back. Not to your life. Not yet. Let's go back to a quiet street in the Bronx, New York City, in the early 1930s. A boy grows up in a working-class Jewish household. His name is not important for now. Let's call him Samuel. Samuel is a gifted child. Sharp, curious, the kind of kid who reads everything he can get his hands on and asks questions that adults find uncomfortable. But Samuel grows up in a particular time. A terrifying time. Every evening, his parents sit by the radio and listen to the news coming out of Europe, and Samuel listens too. He hears about a government across the ocean that has convinced an entire nation, an educated, civilized, modern nation, to participate in the systematic destruction of human beings. He hears names. He hears numbers. Millions of people. And as a boy, Samuel asks the question that most adults were too afraid to ask out loud. How? How does that happen to an entire country of people? How does a father, a teacher, a banker, a train conductor, how does an ordinary man wake up one morning and become part of something like that? What is it inside a human being that allows that to happen? Samuel carries that question with him all the way through school, all the way through college, all the way through his doctoral studies at Harvard University, and all the way into a basement laboratory at Yale University in the summer of 1961. Because Samuel, who by now holds a PhD in psychology and an assistant professorship at one of the most prestigious universities in the United States, has decided he is going to answer that question. Not with philosophy, not with theology, not with guesswork. He is going to find out, in a controlled scientific setting, exactly how far an ordinary American man will go when an authority figure tells him to cause harm to another human being. What Samuel is about to discover will shake the entire field of psychology to its core. It will be called, by some, the most important social science experiment ever conducted. And it will tell us something about ourselves that most of us would rather not know. The year is 1961. Samuel places a small advertisement in a local Connecticut newspaper. The ad is simple. It reads, "Participants wanted for a study on memory and learning. $4.50 for your time." The ad says nothing about obedience, nothing about psychology, nothing about what is really being studied. 40 men respond. They are teachers, engineers, factory workers, accountants, salesmen. They are between the ages of 20 and 50. They are ordinary men from ordinary American lives. They come into the laboratory one by one, and when they arrive, they are introduced to another man. Let's call him Harold, who is supposedly also a volunteer, also there for the same study. The two men draw slips of paper to decide who will be the teacher and who will be the learner. The real volunteer always gets the role of teacher. Harold, who is actually an actor working for Samuel, always gets the role of the learner. The learner, Harold, is taken to an adjacent room and strapped into a chair. Electrodes are attached to his wrist. The teacher, the real volunteer, the ordinary man, is seated in front of a machine. It is an impressive-looking piece of equipment. It has 30 switches arranged in a row, each one labeled with a voltage level, starting at 15 volts and going all the way up to 450 volts. The 450 switch has a label on it. The label reads, in plain text, danger, severe shock, and then one final label beyond that, XXX. The experimenter, a man in a gray lab coat, explains the procedure calmly. The teacher will read a list of word pairs to the learner. The learner will try to remember which words go together. Every time the learner gets an answer wrong, the teacher is to press the next switch and deliver an electric shock. Each mistake means a higher voltage. The teacher is given a sample shock of 45 volts, just so he knows it is real. It stings. And then the experiment begins. At first, everything is manageable. The learner gets some answers right. But then he starts getting them wrong. And the teacher presses the switch. And then the next switch. And then the next. At 75 volts, the teacher can hear Harold grunt in the next room. At 120 volts, Harold shouts that the shocks are becoming painful. At 150 volts, Harold demands to be released from the experiment. At 270 volts, his response is, in Samuel's own written notes, described simply as a scream. And through all of this, every time the teacher hesitates, every time he turns to the man in the gray lab coat and says he is not sure he should continue, the man in the coat says the same four things in the same calm voice. He says, please continue. He says, the experiment requires that you continue. He says, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And if the teacher still resists, he says, you have no other choice. You must go on. Before Samuel ran this experiment, he asked a group of psychiatrists and psychologists to predict what would happen. The consensus was that less than 1% of participants, a small number of pathological outliers, disturbed individuals, would press the switch all the way to 450 volts. The prediction was that normal, decent American men would refuse long before they reached anything dangerous. They were wrong. Every single participant went to at least 300 volts. And 65% of them, nearly 2 out of every 3 ordinary American men, pressed the switch all the way to the maximum, for 150 volts. Tutor to you, not because they were cruel, not because they wanted to hurt Harold. Many of them were visibly distressed. Some were sweating. Some were trembling. Some were laughing nervously, the way human beings laugh when they are in a state of unbearable conflict. And yet, they kept going. Because a man in a gray coat, with a clipboard, in a room that smelled like a university, told them to. Take a moment to really sit with that number. 65%. This was not a handful of outliers. This was not a statistical anomaly. This was the mirror. This was us. Samuel had begun his experiments in the same month that the trial of a man named Karl, a German bureaucrat who had been responsible for organizing the transportation of millions of Jewish prisoners to Nazi death camps, was concluding in Jerusalem. Karl's defense, offered calmly and with apparent sincerity, was simple. He was just following orders. Behavioral scientist. The world had watched that trial and told itself that Karl was a monster, an aberration, a creature unlike the rest of us. Samuel's experiments suggested something far more disturbing. Karl was not the exception. Under the right conditions, Karl was most of us. Now here is where this story gets deeper. Because what Samuel discovered in that basement was not just a fact about human cruelty. It was a fact about human psychology, specifically, about what happens inside a person's mind the moment they place themselves under the authority of someone else. Samuel called it the agentic state. This is the term he used to describe the psychological shift that happens when a person stops seeing themselves as the author of their own actions and begins to see themselves as an instrument of someone else's will. In the agentic state, the weight of moral responsibility does not disappear. It transfers. The person doing the harm tells themselves, sometimes consciously, sometimes not, that they are not truly responsible. The man with the clipboard is responsible. The system is responsible. The institution is responsible. I was just doing what I was told. This is not an excuse people invent after the fact to escape blame. It is a genuine cognitive shift, a real change in the architecture of how the mind processes the meaning of its own actions. And it happens fast. It happens quietly. And it happens to almost everyone. But here is the question that must be asked. Why? Why does the human mind do this? Why, when a figure of authority enters the room, does something in us, something old, something deep, stand at attention? The answer is not simple, and it is not flattering, but it is honest. And it begins not in a laboratory in Connecticut. It begins approximately 200,000 years ago on the African savanna, around the first fires that human beings ever lit. For the overwhelming majority of human history, we did not live in cities. We did not live in nations. We did not have governments or constitutions or courts of law. We lived in small bands, groups of 30 to 50 people, where survival was a collective project. In that world, cooperation was not a virtue. It was oxygen. The individual who challenged the group's leader too aggressively, who defied the hierarchy at the wrong moment, who refused to follow the plan, that individual risked being cast out. And in a world without supermarkets, without hospitals, without locks on doors, being cast out meant death. Not a metaphorical death, not a social death, a real one, cold and final, alone in the dark. So over thousands of generations, the human nervous system learned something. It learned that deference was survival. It learned that the presence of an authority figure, a chief, an elder, a high priest, was a signal to relax the individual moral calculation and trust the structure. Because the structure had kept the tribe alive. And the people who resisted that wiring, who constantly defied the hierarchy on principle, tended not to survive long enough to pass their genes on. We are, in the most literal biological sense, the descendants of the ones who learned to comply. That wiring does not disappear because you live in a house in Ohio or a flat in Manchester. It does not disappear because you went to college or because you consider yourself a free thinker. It is still there, underneath the surface, running quietly in the background of every social interaction you have ever had. It is the thing that makes you drop your voice in a library without being told to. It is the thing that makes you feel guilty arguing with a doctor even when you know something is wrong. It is the thing that made the men in Samuel's laboratory keep pressing that switch. Not evil, wiring. But the wiring alone does not explain the full picture. Because humans are not just biologically wired for deference. We are also socially trained for it from the very first day we draw breath. Think about the first words a child learns in any culture on earth. Stop. No. Sit down. Be quiet. Listen to me. Do what you are told. From the moment we are old enough to understand language, we are enrolled in a curriculum of obedience. We are taught that the correct response to authority is compliance, and that compliance is the same thing as goodness. Good children listen to their parents. Good students listen to their teachers. Good employees listen to their managers. Good citizens listen to their governments. The entire architecture of civilization is built on this equation. And for the most part, it works. Without it, there would be no roads, no hospitals, no functioning societies. Authority is not inherently evil. The capacity to organize human behavior around a hierarchy is one of the reasons we are here at all. But the training does not come with an off switch. And it does not come with a built-in detector for when the person at the top of the hierarchy has lost their claim to the role. This brings us to a different story. A different man. A different kind of laboratory. Except this one had no walls. It was open sky and rice paddies and a Vietnamese village called My Lai on the morning of March 16, 1968. Let's call this man Thomas. Thomas is a 24-year-old warrant officer in the United States Army, a helicopter pilot from Georgia, the son of a Navy veteran who raised him, by all accounts, to act with discipline and integrity. On that morning in March, Thomas is flying a light observation helicopter low over the Vietnamese countryside as part of a search and destroy operation. His job is reconnaissance, fly low, observe, report back. Standard procedure. But as Thomas guides his helicopter over the village below, he begins to see things that do not fit the briefing. He sees bodies, dozens of them, and they are not soldiers. They are old men, women, children, and the soldiers doing the killing are American. He brings his helicopter down. He tries to intervene. He tries to talk to the officers on the ground. He is ignored, or worse, told this is exactly what is supposed to be happening. The soldiers below him are not acting out of individual hatred. They are acting under orders, within a chain of command, inside a structure of authority that told them this was their mission. Over 500 unarmed civilians were killed that day, in what would later be called one of the worst atrocities in American military history. Most of the soldiers present followed their orders. They stayed inside the agentic state. They transferred the moral weight upward and kept going. But Thomas did not. Thomas brought his helicopter down between the American troops and a group of Vietnamese civilians hiding in a bunker. He had his crew train their weapons on the American soldiers and told them that if one more civilian was harmed, he would open fire on his own side. Zen Education Project. He then called in gunship support to evacuate the survivors. When he returned to base, he reported the massacre to his superiors, and his allegations quickly reached the operation's overall commander. Warrant Officer his story. Thomas did what, according to every experiment Samuel ever ran, the overwhelming majority of people cannot bring themselves to do. He stepped outside the structure. He named what he was seeing. He chose his own conscience over the authority of the system he was inside. And the system's response was entirely consistent with the pattern. He was given a distinguished flying cross, and the citation for the award fabricated events, praising him for rescuing a child caught in crossfire rather than acknowledging what he had actually done. Warrant Officer his story. The truth of that morning was buried for decades. Thomas was not celebrated. He was vilified by fellow veterans for years. Threatened, harassed. The pattern does not welcome the people who name it. It marginalizes them. It rewrites their stories. It waits for them to go away. And now let us go back to another room. Not a battlefield. A classroom. The year is 1951. A researcher we will call Dr. Aaron is running a deceptively simple experiment at a college in Pennsylvania. He brings a group of young men into a room and asks them to do something that a child could do. He shows them two cards. On the first card is a single line. On the second card are 3 lines of different lengths, labeled A, B, and C. The task is to identify which of the 3 lines on the second card matches the length of the line on the first card. The answer is obvious. It is not a trick. One of the lines is identical in length to the target line, and the other 2 are clearly longer or shorter. A near-perfect rate of correct response when people are asked individually. Wikipedia, but here is the setup. The young man who has been recruited as the real subject does not know that every other person in the room is an actor. And one by one, as the cards are shown, the actors begin giving the wrong answer. Confidently, unanimously, they all point to the same line, the wrong line, with complete certainty. And then it is the real subject's turn. He can see, with his own eyes, that the correct answer is different from what everyone else is saying. His vision is fine. His intelligence is not in question. He knows what he sees. And yet, in experiment after experiment, approximately 1/3 of real participants conformed to the incorrect group consensus, despite knowing the answers were wrong. EBSCO, when researchers interviewed the subjects afterward and asked why they had given an answer they knew to be incorrect, the answers were revealing. Some said they had genuinely started to doubt their own perception. They said, maybe I was wrong. Maybe they could see something I couldn't. Others said they knew they were right, but did not want to be the only one in the room who disagreed. They said, it didn't seem worth it. The social cost of being the lone dissenter outweighed the intellectual cost of giving a wrong answer about a line on a card. Think about that. A line on a card. And a third of people could not hold to the truth of their own eyes when a room full of strangers pushed back. Now scale that up. Do not think about cards and lines. Think about the things that matter. Think about a meeting at work where a decision is being made that you know is wrong, but every senior person in the room is nodding along. Think about a policy being rolled out that does not sit right with you, but the consensus around the table is unanimous. Think about a relationship where someone you respect keeps telling you a version of events that contradicts what you felt and experienced. The mechanism is the same. The card with the line is just the stripped-down version. The real experiment runs constantly, everywhere, in every room you walk into, in every institution you belong to, in every family you are part of. The pressure to conform to the perceived authority of consensus is not an occasional experience. It is the water we swim in. This pattern is not new. This is not a 20th century discovery. This is not something that emerged in the modern world. This pattern is old as civilization itself. And the civilizations that understood it most deeply did not hide it in laboratories or academic journals. They encoded it in their stories. They built it into their myths. Because long before there were psychologists, there were storytellers. And the storytellers had already mapped the territory. Consider the world of ancient Rome at the height of the empire. A society built on the most sophisticated obedience machinery the ancient world had ever constructed. The Roman legions were not simply armies. They were social systems specifically engineered to produce compliance. The military concept known as disciplina was not a rule. It was a worldview. Roman soldiers were trained from their first day in service not just to obey orders, but to understand obedience as the very source of Roman greatness. The legion worked because every man inside it trusted the structure more than his own individual judgment. In battle, that structure saved lives. The coordinated, disciplined Roman formation was militarily superior to almost everything it encountered precisely because individual soldiers had surrendered their independent decision-making to the collective authority of the command. But here is where it becomes interesting. The same quality that made the Roman legions nearly invincible in the field also made the Roman state vulnerable from within. When the authority at the top of that structure became corrupt, when emperors began ruling by fear and manipulation rather than by merit and military logic, the soldiers and citizens who had been trained their entire lives to defer to the top of the hierarchy had no cultural template for resistance. The system had produced perfect instruments of obedience. And perfect instruments of obedience cannot protect the society that built them when the authority at the top begins to rot. Across the ocean and across the centuries, the same pattern plays out in civilizations that had no contact with Rome and had never heard of disciplina. The Aztec Empire in what is now Mexico built its entire social and cosmological order around the absolute authority of the Tlatoani, the ruler, the speaker, the one who stood between the people and the gods. Disobedience to the Tlatoani was not merely illegal. It was cosmologically catastrophic. It threatened the sun itself. The priests and storytellers of that civilization had constructed a worldview in which the hierarchy was not a human invention. It was a divine necessity. Comply with the structure, and the universe remains in order. Defy it, and everything falls apart. This was not cynical propaganda invented by a ruling class to control a frightened population, although it functioned that way. It was a genuine cosmological belief, deeply held, woven into every festival, every ritual, every story told to children. The authority of the hierarchy had been fused so completely with the authority of reality itself that challenging the one felt like challenging the other. This is the most elegant and the most dangerous form of the pattern. Because when authority is cosmological, when it is encoded not just in law but in myth, in religion, in the stories that tell people who they are and what the world means, the individual who questions it does not just risk punishment. They risk meaning itself. And this is why, across virtually every culture and every century, The storytelling tradition always contains a figure who embodies the act of defiance. In Greek mythology, it is the man we will call the firebringer, the titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. He is one of the most celebrated figures in the entire Greek canon. He is credited with civilization itself, with the gift of light and heat and the capacity for technology. And yet, the gods punish him in a way that the Greeks considered the most terrible fate imaginable. They chain him to a rock for eternity, and every day an eagle tears out his liver, and every night the liver grows back, and the next day it happens again. Forever. The myth does not celebrate defiance without cost. It celebrates the firebringer and then shows, in unflinching detail, what the structure does to those who step outside it. The message that the Greek storytellers encoded is the same message that Samuel's laboratory would produce 3,000 years later. Breaking from the authority of the structure is possible. It has been done, and the structure will extract a price. Every time, without exception. In Norse mythology, the same figure appears in a different form, a trickster god who is simultaneously celebrated and feared, who defies the authority of the divine hierarchy repeatedly and with great cleverness, and who is eventually captured and punished in a manner that mirrors the firebringer almost exactly. He is chained underground, and the punishment continues until the end of the world. In the trickster traditions of West African oral literature, in the stories of the spider figure who outsmarts kings and gods with cunning and wit, the same ambivalence is present. These stories celebrate the figure who defies authority, and they show him surviving, but never safely, never without consequence, never fully trusted again. The trickster lives outside the hierarchy, and living outside the hierarchy is not freedom. It is exile. It is the permanent condition of the person who has named the pattern and can no longer pretend they do not see it. This is the part of the conversation that is almost never had in public. We celebrate the whistleblowers and the rebels after the fact, after history has safely reclassified them, after enough decades have passed that the authority they defied has dissolved or been discredited. We put their faces on stamps and name schools after them and say, "Look at these extraordinary people who stood up for what was right." And then we quietly, collectively, fail to ask the obvious follow-up question. Why did everyone else stay seated? Why did the people standing next to the hero, people who could see exactly the same things the hero could see, stay inside the structure and keep following the orders? The answer is not cowardice, though it sometimes looks like cowardice from a distance. The answer is the wiring. The same wiring that kept our ancestors alive around the fire circle. The same shift into the agentic state that Samuel's laboratory documented with meticulous precision. The same social pressure that made a third of Dr. Aaron's subjects deny the evidence of their own eyes rather than be the one in the room who disagrees. These are not personality flaws. These are features of the human operating system, installed over 200,000 years of survival by compliance, polished to a high shine by every civilization that has ever existed, and running at full speed in every room, every institution, every relationship, every hierarchy you have ever been part of. Here is the thing that almost no one tells you. Here is the part that the textbooks leave out, that the motivational content skips over, that the self-help industry does not have a product to sell you about. The capacity for obedience and the capacity for moral courage are not opposites. They are the same drive, pointed in different directions. The men in Samuel's laboratory who kept pressing that switch were not choosing evil over good. They were choosing the path of least resistance through a social situation that had been carefully designed to make compliance feel like the only available option. They were doing what the architecture of the room told them to do. And the architecture of that room is not so different from the architecture of a lot of rooms we spend our lives in. The boss who tells you the numbers have to be reported a certain way. The institution that tells you the policy is the policy, and that is the end of the conversation. The social group that tells you, through 100 tiny signals, that disagreement is unwelcome and that the price of speaking up is the warmth of belonging. None of these situations feel like a laboratory in New Haven, but they are running the same experiment, and they are getting, in most cases, the same results. Now here is the uncomfortable truth, the one that sits at the very center of everything we have been talking about. It applies to you, not as an accusation, as a recognition, because recognizing the pattern is the only way to have any relationship with it other than being run by it. At some point in your life, possibly many points, you have been inside the agentic state. You have handed the moral weight of a decision upward and told yourself that someone else was responsible for what happened next. You have been in a room where the consensus was wrong, and you have stayed quiet, or nodded along, or convinced yourself that the line on the card was actually shorter than you thought it was. You have been Thomas before he landed his helicopter, still circling, still taking in what he was seeing, not yet sure whether the cost of acting was something he was willing to pay. That is not a condemnation. That is a description of what it means to be human inside a social world. We are all somewhere on that dial between compliance and conscience, and the dial moves depending on the room, the stakes, the perceived authority of the figure giving the instructions, and a dozen other variables that we often cannot fully see in the moment we are inside them. But here is what Samuel's experiments also showed, and this is the part that does not get nearly enough attention. In a variation where participants were allowed to select their own voltage levels without being prompted by the experimenter, only about 2.5% used the maximum shock level. Encyclopedia Britannica, when the authority was removed, when the man in the gray coat stopped saying please continue, and the experiment requires that you continue, the behavior changed almost entirely. The people did not suddenly become capable of cruelty on their own. They were not naturally inclined toward it. The cruelty required the structure. The structure was the switch. This tells us something important. It tells us that the capacity to cause harm under authority is not the same as the desire to cause harm. And it also tells us the inverse, that the capacity to resist authority is not some extraordinary gift possessed only by exceptional people. It is available to almost everyone, almost all the time. What stands between a person and that capacity is not strength of character or moral superiority. It is visibility. It is the ability to see the room you are standing in clearly enough to know that you are inside an experiment. Because the experiment only works when you don't know you're in it. The moment you see the dial, the moment you recognize the gray coat and the clipboard and the voice saying please continue, the moment you name what is happening and ask yourself whether the weight you have handed upward actually belongs there, that moment changes everything. Not easily, not painlessly, not without cost. As the Firebringer knew, and as Thomas knew, and as the White Rose students knew, and as every person who has ever chosen truth over structure has always known. But it changes something fundamental. It changes the question from how did that happen to how do I choose what happens next. There is a question that Samuel carried with him out of that Bronx apartment building as a boy, listening to his parents sit by the radio in the dark. He wanted to know how ordinary people in an ordinary civilization could participate in extraordinary evil. He spent his entire career trying to answer it. What he found was not a comfortable answer. It was not an answer that allowed anyone to stand at a safe distance from the problem and point at the people who did the bad things. It was an answer that put the question inside every person who heard it, including him, including us. The most dangerous thing about authority is not the authority itself. It is the invisible architecture it builds inside the people it governs. The architecture that makes compliance feel like reason. That makes deference feel like wisdom. That makes the transfer of moral responsibility feel like the only available option in a room that has been designed, whether intentionally or not, to make it seem that way. You are not standing outside that architecture right now. None of us are. But you are, if you have stayed with this until the end, standing somewhere different than you were 17 minutes ago. Because you have named the pattern. And a pattern you can name is a pattern you can question. And a pattern you can question is one you have a fighting chance of choosing your own relationship with, rather than simply being carried along inside it. Samuel's question, the boy's question, the question that came out of the darkness of a Bronx apartment in wartime, was never really about the Germans. It was never really about the laboratory in New Haven. It was always about the room you are standing in right now, and the one you will walk into tomorrow, and the one after that. The real question is not whether you are capable of obedience. You are. We all are. The question is, when the man in the gray coat says, "Please continue," what are you going to do? Now we want to hear from you. What is a moment in your life when you followed along with something and only later realized you had a choice? Drop your answer in the comments below. Every single one gets read. And next time, we are going inside the civilizations that tried to dismantle authority structures entirely, and what happened to every single one of them. You will not want to miss that one. If this landed with you, you already know